Welcome to my budget deck channel, where I try to make decks as cheap and playable as possible. So if this is something you'd be interested in, then why not subscribe? So, new pack, and you probably opened some of the Ancient Warriors, but you're not sure, should I build this deck? What can I do with this? Is there something I can do to just trial it out first? You've come to the right place. This is a deck profile that is specifically tailored towards, well, a cheaper playstyle. If you don't want to invest into so many different kind of cards that you would need, sadly, you can already see you have to run a basic amount of nearly like every single expensive Ancient Warriors monster, because the deck itself is not 100% super consistent if you don't stick to certain cards that you kind of have to run. And we will be talking about which cards these are, why you have to run them, what ratios I would recommend, and what other cards you can be running, as well as I will be rating the deck later on, and also will be showing off some replay. First of all, this is probably one of the most important cards. Every combo video that you will see online will have this card in it at one point, because this card can do very much. First of all, the very important effect is that you can send one card from your hand or field to the graveyard to add one Ancient Warriors monster from your deck to your hand. Mainly, you want to be searching this one, because this one, when it's added from the deck to your hand, then you can special summon it. And then with this one, because it's a wind monster, you can actually go into the Link monster, one of the other very important cards in this specific variant, or in general in any Ancient Warriors deck. Also, this card has a second effect, which most of the level 4 Ancient Warriors actually do have. If another Ancient Warriors monster effect is activated, then you can target one monster your opponent controls, return to the hand. The other ones are like monster negate, spell trap card negate, and so on. We'll be seeing this very soon. This one, for example, has one effect monster negate if you activate one of the other Ancient Warriors monster effects, which can come in somewhat handy as well. This card is very, very important in this specific variant, because we do not run any other kind of consistency cards really. Lots of people would be running Pot of Extravagance, for example, but that would mean that you have to run triple this card, and that's a bit excessive, bit expensive. Other than that, your extra deck doesn't really matter overly, but you kind of, first of all, I don't like the fact that you might be risking banishing all three of them. That's not something I'm very comfortable with, because this card is very important in the deck. And secondly, you'd have to craft another 2 ultra rares, which I feel like we already run one more than I would like to in the end, but it's still fairly doable. And if you want to knuckle down on this deck at one point, you will need to craft a lot more ultra rares of generic go second staples, for example. So we have this card now, which also can start some of the combos. What you need to know with this is you can target one continuous spell trap you control, send it to the graveyard, and add one other one to your hand, which mainly you will be adding this one to your hand, because this one allows you to special summon another monster from your hand, and then you can easily start going into your Link monster as well. And this card can also turn one of your monsters, well, one Ancient Warrior monster on the field, into a Wind monster, so you can actually easily go into your Link monster regardless of what card you have in hand. But you also run quite a few Wind monsters actually in general, so usually that's not too much of a problem. This card also allows you to send this card to the graveyard and then special summon one monster from your hand, because if this card is sent to the graveyard, then that is another effect. So both of these cards basically special summon you one from your hand. So this is also nice. And if you have another special summonable card in your hand, then you can also search this card with this one, and then get another search when you special summon the other monster, and technically continue, set up place for the next turn, and so on and so on and so on. And this is also a good way of sending this one to the graveyard, but I'll be talking about this later stage of the deck profile. One of this, if you want to keep it as cheap as possible and want to focus more on the go first variant, which I would recommend at the start, because before you put lots of generic go second staples in, go second budget decks tend to have the issue that, especially in a fast-paced, very strong meta, they will not be doing all that much, because your opponent already has so much time to set up boards, because you don't run enough disruption or enough power spell traps that can actually stop your opponent's board once it's fully established. So I feel like going first, banking on the 2-3 disruptions that you can get off of this deck, is a lot better usually. So technically you can cut this, run one other level 4 or lower Ancient Warriors monster. Well, I think they're all level 4 at least. then because of the ratios. So if you don't want to invest into this one, this could save you another super rare if you don't want to craft this. If you want to focus very much on the go second variant, I would play this card at least at 2 because it actually does a lot. Although it used to be not as good because at one point if you just normal summon this and then you use the effect of this card, your opponent negates it, you basically run out of place unless you drew exactly like 1 or 2 other cards that would help you in that specific situation. But Ancient Warriors have that problem in general, kind of. Another card you might not be seeing that much, and it's mainly in here because of it is a budget variant, and we do only have 2 Tenkis because it's semi-limited, and so on and so on and so on. We don't run certain consistency cards that you might want to be running, and this card still has a nice effect because you can get rid of one of continuous spell trap you control. It's mainly good going second, but technically it doesn't have to be. If you have one other monster on board, you can also lower the attack of one of the other monsters to send one of them to the graveyard if you really have to. Also, the second effect is where it's really at. You can target one Ancient Warrior card in your graveyard and add it back to your hand if a card your opponent controls is destroyed by battle card effect, which is quite easy in this deck to actually pull off. So it does gain you resources over time. It can recycle your extra deck monster back to the extra deck, so that's something you kind of want to keep in the back of your head with this one. So this one isn't terrible, but also I can understand why you would rather run other ones there. I think there's the one that recycles your continuous spell traps from the graveyard and also can destroy a spell trap when one of the other effects is activated, so you could be running this instead of that one as well if you really want to. This one is a spell trap negate on board, and when it's added by an Ancient Warriors card effect, then you can special summon it. It's a wind monster. In general, it's quite a neat card. We have one of this one. Technically, what you can be doing is you can be running 2 of this if you want to be only running 2 of this. If you want to be going for super budget, just trial the deck out, you will be able to get away with 2 of this. You don't have to run 3 of this, but I want to make a cheapish way, which is usually trying to not get over 4 ultra rares, and make it as playable as possible though, because it's not really helping you much if you have a very cheap deck but you lose every game, because then you won't want to go further into this deck no matter how good it is, because it's just not fun to be playing. And I feel like this card adds quite a lot to it. But if you want to be cutting one of them, you could run 2 of this. This is basically a battle hand trap. It's quite nice going second, doesn't do all that much going first, although it can technically go off if you have it in your hand. If you added it to your hand, then it's kind of well, the opponent knows that it's going to come, so they can play around it. If you just manage to draw into it, then this can be quite nice, because at the start of damage step, when your Ancient Warrior monsters battles, doesn't have to declare an attack, then you can special summon this card from your hand, and if you do, the opponent's monster loses 1000 attack points, and if a card your opponent controls is destroyed by battle for card effect, you can destroy another one, which can come in handy if you go in second, because usually you destroy your opponent's monster by battle, then once you get this effect off, and then this effect instantly triggers as well, and then you can pop another card. One of the new cards you might have pulled from the new set, this one. This card is a bit iffy. I feel like 1 is definitely enough, because it can be kind of bricky, because it can special summon itself. You kind of have to rely on the effects of this card or this card to actually special summon it, which can be a bit annoying at least. You can technically tribute summon it at one point, especially in conjunction with this one, but might as well then special summon it with this card. And this card has a very, very neat effect. It has this burn, which can help you if you go first and you have a way of summoning this card out, because then you can put your opponent into easier OTK range. Not that this deck can't OTK in the first place, but it makes it a bit easier. And if it's normal special summon, you can add 1 level 7 or higher Ancient Warrior monster or Ancient Warrior's continuous spell trap from your deck to your hand, which can set up plays for the next turn. Wish it was level 6 or higher, because then you could actually search the battle trap, which might be quite handy. And the last effect, which is somewhat nice as well, is if if a monster is sent to your opponent's graveyard, either way, you can target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it, and if you do, draw 1 card. So it pluses you actually 2, and it also gets rid of cards in your opponent's graveyard, which in the current meta can be quite nice actually. This effect somewhat has a bit of an issue with running Path of Prosperity, but I'll be talking about this in a second. Next card, the Go Second staple. What's important about this card is you can summon it multiple times per turn with its effect. Technically, it doesn't really matter because once you have one of them on board, you won't have another one. But if your opponent Appaloosa negates the activation, because this special summon activates, it's not one of the special summons like this, where your opponent can't react to it. This one activates in your hand, but if they negate it, you can just do it again, if it's like not a negate and destroy, because then it doesn't go to the graveyard and you can keep going. So this card actually is a very good out to Appaloosa because it also has a pop effect, and if your opponent has more monsters than just the Appaloosa, then you can try attempt to pop Appaloosa, they'll have to negate it, and then the Appaloosa should be on 2400 attack, and then you can just run it over. Bit annoying to sacrifice the battle phase, but it is what it is sometimes. This card can be a heavy beat stick going second, this card can be an extender going first, so at least in one, because it's easily searchable, can play that too if you want to. Yeah, at your discretion, you don't want to clog up your hand too much with level 7 or higher monsters, so even level 6, because you can't really do all that much with it. One Kaiju, because there are unaffected cards around still, and your attack points are kind of capped around like a cheeky 4000. If your opponent has a big board, then this card can get somewhat high, but I don't think there's much of a way to get over 4000 attack points with this deck specifically, unless you specifically get this card and then your opponent has another monster, then you can like gain attack and so on and so on and so on, but usually you're kind of capped at this. So one Kaiju can be helpful from time to time. It's a numbers game. Sometimes you will draw it when you need it, sometimes you don't, but for a go second deck, I don't think Kaijus are too bad, even on the crackback in general. One of the cards I already talked about, this card is very, very important for the deck. That's why I do decide to run it at 3. It's not one of these like bread and butter cards of, oh, if you don't run this card at 3, then you will definitely lose and you can't really play this deck. You can cut it down to 2 and it works. Like people have done it to 2. People play this card at 2, just even without budget variant. I feel like in this specific variant though, the 3 just makes so much sense because you don't always want to be searching. Sometimes you want to be searching other stuff, and this card is an extender every single time. It just gets another body on board. It's important going first, it's important going second. You have to notice something though, and that is, this is basically the only card that kind of xenolocks you, because if you destroy the monster with the highest attack points, you also cannot activate monster effects the turn you activate this effect, except Ancient Warrior monsters. So hand traps don't really work well with this, especially if you want to go first. It's a bit problematic, but yeah, it is what it is. And also, if your opponent controls a monster with the highest attack on the field, give control of this card to your opponent, which is a bit weird, so you have to kind of get rid of your opponent's stuff. But it could work in combination with this card's second effect. Not that this ever really comes up, but technically it can. Just is what it is. But since this effect happens during the end phase, you would have to go through a whole turn of your opponent still having this on board, so it doesn't combo that well with this card's effect. But this whole deck is very much about lore, so this is why this is in here. And also this card must be special summoned by controlling the highest attack Ancient Warriors monster, so you can run into a bit of an issue if you play against another Ancient Warriors deck and you go second, because then they might have the highest Ancient Warrior monster for quite a while, and also only during the main phase, so you can kind of work around this effect by entering the battle phase, so keep that one in mind as well. Raigeki, free cards that you get in one of the decks, structured decks, starter decks I think, so you don't have to invest anything into this, good for going second. Even if it goes first variant, you don't need that much else, because you will be on 2 or 3 disruptions, so it's not actually too bad if you stuff the rest of your deck with go second cards like this one for example, like this one, and also Infinite Impermanence is a card that kind of helps you go in second, so one Raigeki should be fine. Monster Reborn for 2 reasons. First of all, it's an extender, because sometimes you have to link this card off, or a lot of the time, to go into your link monster, and if you be able to summon this one back with Monster Reborn, then you have another bounce on board, which is actually quite nice. This is mainly for back row, but can be helpful if your opponent also plays a very monster heavy deck at the start of your turn if you go second. Not so good if you go first and then still have monsters on board, but it is what it is. You can swap this out. Some other cards that are important, Dark Ruler No More comes to mind, Triple Tactic Talent comes to mind, but since you kind of, I count this as a free card because you get them in these Master Pack bundled, same for those 2. Yeah, it is what it is. You can play any other cards in here if you want. This one, might conflict a bit because first of all you can't draw a card, but usually that doesn't matter because that happens more during your opponent's turn. Can happen during your turn, of course, but usually you summon other stuff during your turn, especially if you go for like the go second kind of variant, then you would be searching other cards, and this only comes up if you draw exactly those 2 cards. But if you draw exactly those 2 cards, you won't be OTKing anyway because Pot of Prosperity kind of stops you from doing that. Still, you really need this card for consistency, otherwise you will end up with a lot more unplayable hands. So I would take that hit a bit of not being able to sometimes OTK your opponent, especially because this version is meant to go first anyway. Sounds a bit strange in a go second deck, but trust me, if for a budget deck that it makes more sense. I've tried it, makes a bit more sense in total. And then you can't use that effect with the draw. It's okay. You have to wait during your opponent's turn, but that's mainly what it's there for a lot of the time. Anyway, and another card that conflicts with this specific one is Dimensional Fissure, because obviously if there is no monster being sent to your opponent's graveyard, then this effect can't trigger either. But the good thing about this is very graveyard focused meta right now, with Tier Element coming up, with the Ishizu cards being already in the meta and so on, and even Sprite does some stuff with the graveyard, so I feel like Dimensional Fissure is actually somewhat nice. And it doesn't really interfere with your playstyle too much, especially if you go first. You can just put this card down in the end of the turn, so it doesn't really matter. And you can turn this card off at will with your Link monster, because you can just send it to the graveyard, because for the effect that bounces, you have to send 1 card from your hand or field to the graveyard. Obviously, once this is on board, you can only send spell traps, because monsters don't go to the graveyard, so you can't use it for this. But you can always turn this card off with it, which is quite nice. Or if you have any of the other spell traps, it doesn't really matter then, still fine. You will still have the link materials for this card in the graveyard because you use this after you've gone into the link monster, so this is quite nice. And obviously cards like this, cards like this, cards like this also all turn this card off if you want it, so it is somewhat one-sided floodgate that is very good against the current meta and is a rare card, so I definitely would run this. And by being a continuous spell trap, it actually even works with this card very well. Even if you don't want to use it, it still has use in the deck other than just being a floodgate. Fire Formation Tenki, very nice card, searches you all of the low level ones. Mainly want to be searching this, but who knows, sometimes you draw this in a later stage, and then still, this one will be the best, but if you have another card in hand, still a free search, and you can send it off the effects of the other cards. This one, very strong card. You definitely want to be having this before you summon a monster, because it gets you free cards, and if you get rid of it, then you can special summon another one. This is a combo. If you have this card up, or if you get it on the board with this card, even if you haven't used the first effect, if you get your Link's monster up, and you've searched for this card, then during your opponent's turn, you can use this effect, bounce one of your opponent's cards, then send this card to the graveyard, this card's effect triggers, then you can special summon this from your hand, then you have another interaction and your opponent has to then pay life points, and so on and so on. This is an easier way of getting this card out. I play one of this. It's good going second, and the second effect isn't terrible. It can get you into this card, for example, then if you want it for the next turn, especially in combination with this, it can be quite helpful. And sometimes this can actually fetch and negate, because it helps you beat over some stuff that your opponent would rather you don't beat over. This card, very good going second. It can work going first, because it makes it so your opponent can't respond to your Ancient Warriors cards and effects, which is quite nice. So yeah, I don't think this is a bad one. And also all the monsters, when this card is sent to the graveyard, will be having this effect. When the card declares an attack, you can destroy one card your opponent controls. Very good to get rid of floodgates, very good to get rid of like back row heavy stuff. Against Runic it can be a bit annoying, so that's quite nice. In general, this is for one of searchable card, a very strong card in my opinion. The new card, definitely 3 of in my opinion, because it helps you so much more to go into your Link monster and start your Link plays, which before you had real issues with, because most of your monsters, especially going first, couldn't actually special summon themselves from their hand, so you had to really rely on getting this card out. And nowadays, yeah, that just doesn't cut it anymore, because you don't have that many ways to search it out of the deck. So this actually gives you a lot more depth to the deck, because this card is first of all somewhat searchable, and also it does lots of stuff, and it makes this card a lot more viable as well. We can ignore the second effect most of the time. It's just, well, if you play a mirror match, this card would make it very interesting, is all I can say. But yeah, gladly this deck isn't too meta relevant. You'll not be running into too many of those, so you have to really be dealing with this. One Book of Moon, mainly for the fact, and now hear me out, usually I would be playing stuff like Forbidden Chalice, and in total I would say play Triple Infinite Impermanence if you have it, because this is the only real hand trap that you can use without hampering your ability to use this card's effect. This card over Forbidden Chalice, because sometimes when your opponent has a 3000 attack point monster that you need to negate the effects, it leaves them at 3,400 attack points, and this card caps at 3,300 attack points unless you have like Tenki on board or something, because this card gains 500 by this one, and then you have a bit of an issue getting rid of your opponent's monster, and this is a bit sad. So I decided to go for this one because usually it mattered more, especially with Sprite around. Sometimes it's good if you just flip their level 2 monster and then they can't do stuff and so on, but obviously it's up to you. For me, this worked a tiny bit better, but that might have just been by luck of testing. In the end, a monster negate is obviously quite nice as well, because both of them are good going second, going first. This one doesn't work on link monster, so there is that. For the extra deck, some random rank 4 kind of cards that don't really matter too much. You can play Baguska if you have it, very important. Level 7, like rank 7 cards, not overly useful either. Firefighting to Rumadol, actually a card that might come up, so that's why it's at 2. This card you want to be playing at 2, but 1 is fine. It's kind of the same like this. Technically, I would want to make this like a 5 ultra rare deck, but you don't need to. You can cut one of this and leave it like this, and you're still fine, but you do lose out on some stuff on the crackback if you only have one of this, especially if your opponent negates it. It's hard to get back to the extra deck because you basically only have this as recovery. Geonator Transverser, very much budget hero, power code talker can be coming up sometimes. This card actually quite nice because you have lots of wind monsters and you can even make your monsters wind monsters. You have to watch out with the effect of link monsters, obviously, with the and activating the effects because of this card, but sometimes the effect of this one can be nice, and this is another way of being able to get up to 4,800 attack, and playing it with Dimensional Fissure can actually be somewhat nice because no monsters in your opponent's graveyard can come up more often than you think, and then it can actually happen. Still, you would need like go into it with this card possibly plus like another wind monster. It's not impossible, so I run it, but it's not crazy. Kind of the same with this one. This one can be really helpful, but also can be absolutely useless. This one is just a budget link 4. If you have a better one, run a better one. This deck kind of dies to hand traps quite easily, as most rogue decks and most budget decks do, so Called by the Rogue comes to mind. Can run this card and some other cards to keep in mind. Obviously IP Masquerena, very nice card. This one you could be playing at 1 if you want to, but I don't think it's necessary you invest in this. It's not a bad card, but it's not necessarily needed. You could decide on running one of this. Since it's so searchable, it can be nice, and especially the last effect, when an opponent monsters declares an attack, you can banish this card from your graveyard and special summon one Ancient Warriors monster from your deck is actually not too bad, and especially going first, this card can actually really help you because it can stop your opponent's stuff. It can be sent to the graveyard by cards like this one, for example. Doesn't matter, it can do lots of things. It's not amazing though. If you want to be playing one of this, even like cut one of this maybe, then it's possible, but I wouldn't recommend it. Let's go to the rating section next. Okay, it's rating time. For the strength, I'd give it a 3, but bordering to 4. Really, really strong boards are possible, but the average board is just not overwhelming. It's not bad, and it definitely has its strengths to it, and the fact that it can go first and go second actually adds a lot to this. So this is why it's very difficult between a 3 or 4. I will give it a 3 just in comparison to some other decks, because I have to be a bit critical of some of the stuff, and also the consistency plays a bit into the overall strength of the deck. It is what it is. It is bordering to a 4 though, so keep that in mind. It's not as bad as it might look. Talking about consistency wise, I would be giving it a 2, but I think the new card added a lot in consistency for the place, and this deck has a lot of good searches now. It's not as terrible as it used to be. A very low 3 though, like this is the other end of the spectrum basically. Makes you feel like I should maybe include a higher scale, but I would say it's still a 3. It has its searchers, it can consistently pump out like 2 disruptions at least, it can consistently go second, but you will be having like 3 out of 10 hands sadly that will be doing not much, because we'll be breaking on like high level monsters on some continuous spell traps that just don't do all that much. So this is why I would say a 3, but on the lower spectrum. I don't feel like a 2 is completely warranted, but a 3 would be kind of high for what it actually is. In terms of budget value, I have to be a bit more critical. I will give this a 2, not because it's not a good deck, but the deck itself is pretty like mid-tier. It's not like an awful deck, it's not like an amazing deck. It does its job, it is a bit versatile, so you don't have to be too scared of going first or second, but you also can't be too confident of either of the two. And also a very big thing when it comes to budget value, this deck doesn't have too many generic staples in it, so they can't do much for other decks. You have Tenki and the pot, but you possibly already have the pot, and Tenki only does so much for like Tri-Brigade and other kind of stuff, Lunar Lights and whatnot. It's okay, it's not great. And then the massive problem of this deck, even though it doesn't really Xenolock you, it kind of does by the fact of how many Ancient Warriors you have to run, so you basically can only play like a pure variant, and the playstyle will always somewhat be the same. So in the end, you don't have like generic staples in this specific version, because that's what the rating is about, and you also don't have that many different decks, and it's not like a crazy deck, because for how expensive it is, you can build a decent like Sprite deck, for example, and that will get you probably a bit further if you invest a bit more into this deck. It can be a lot stronger, especially in a best of one. This deck can excel, but at this point I would be giving it a 2, bordering to a 3 again, but I don't feel like in comparison to lots of other budget decks, it's as budget value wise as good. Obviously that doesn't mean you shouldn't get this deck. This deck can be really fun, it has an amazing art style, it has amazing gameplay style in my opinion. It just, in comparison to crafting other decks, you can't do as much with it. And on to the replay. Alright, here we are with the replay. I actually picked a go second replay because the go first replays are kind of always the same. Either you get hand trapped and then you have a bit of an issue and you can't really set up a good board, or you go into the same kind of combo over and over again and then hope your opponent can't deal with like 2-3 disruptions, and you can finish them on the crackback. Sometimes you can, sometimes I can't. The go second is where it really is at with this specific deck, and you can see the hand is actually somewhat decent. It's not a bad hand at all. You have a good play starter, you have some cards that interact with your opponent's board, but obviously you do not have a hand trap, so this could become problematic, and we'll be putting it into high speed because you can already see this is going to take a while, and it's going to take even longer than you think, because they are playing some very convoluted way of ending on something that might be a bit worse than actual punk decks. You'll see what I'm talking about. We can already kind of think of what we're going to be doing. We obviously don't want to just normal summon this, get negated, and then concede, but we have certain options. They will have stuff in the graveyard that we can use to our advantage. We have Book of Moon, so if they end on some monster negates, we can at least force them out with this one. We have a way of going into this card first, for example, with our cards in hand. So there's lots of stuff that we can be doing. You can already see there's crazy stuff going on. They're going into so much stuff with Entity Intis, going into Ancient Fairy Dragon, popping the Field Spell. It's somewhat creative, don't get me wrong. It's fun to see, but I don't know if how much this actually adds to it. Now we're going into Tomahawk, crazy, doing the classic Tomahawk plays. I thought we were going to end on some Therion negate or stuff, but no, we're not done here. We're doing all of this kind of shenanigans. Then we're going into IP Masquerena, we're going into Sprite Elf here. We have this whole kind of thing going for us. We're going into Mecha Phantom Beast, of course, the classic playmaker of certain decks. We have O-Line, Hyper Librarian. Not sure if Hyper Librarian actually comes in handy here. Yes, you can revive O-Line back and you can go into another synchro, but I think it only draws you like 2 cards here, which yes is good. I mean, look at the card advantage, but I felt like this could have probably been doing a bit more. They drew into all of their cards and possibly have some hand traps that may or may not come into play here. So somewhat of a board. I would assume they have like the punk trap. I'm pretty sure they added this at one point, and they have some other kind of spell traps that may or may not be useful. We don't know. Maybe it's called by the grave as well. There can be lots of stuff. This card makes it so I cannot target this one with spell traps, which is something to, well, sometimes that can be important. Not sure if it matters that much. Don't know if they have power tool dragon plays or something, why they run this card in here. Who knows? It's somewhat interesting. So what we have to be dealing with is one negate that's an omni negate but doesn't destroy, cards that can actually get IP Masquerena back and then go into good link plays, and at least one trap card that's going to annoy us, and possibly hand traps that actually do stuff. So what we're going to be doing here is we first of all go into our Go Second Master card that can actually bait out lots of stuff. We have to watch out here though, since we cannot target these two because of Sprite Elf's effect. So what we're trying to do is get rid of Sprite Elf here. They have to negate this with the Punk Trap, which is fine, which we don't really mind too much. It has an effect that our monsters cannot be targeted, the other monsters that we have, so it's a bit annoying that we lose this one, because this would have come in handy for this one. Especially if they had done it the other way around, then this would have mattered, but since they did it that way, not sure if they have much more targeting stuff. Now we've realized that Monster Reborn will probably be quite good, because the graveyard is full of stuff. The graveyard has lots of cards that are somewhat usable. I thought about using Ancient Fairy Dragon, but I wasn't quite happy with the attack stats, and high attack stats might come in handy, especially if I want to OTK later on, so I decided to go for the Punk Synchro monster here. Summon that in attack position, which kind of threatens the whole Sprite kind of thing, but I didn't want to straight go to the battle phase, because I felt like I could sniff out a way where I can actually break their board and possibly OTK, because they're only on 6,000 life, and that isn't too hard for the combos of Ancient Warriors to get through, and we still have lots of combos here. So what I did was to special summon this one, because this one can actually stop spell traps. So one of these two will not be doing all that much, because I can send this card to the graveyard then. So I felt like this was something that could be potentially annoying. Then once I kind of gave up on that thought, I was considering this at the time, but I had to proceed from here, because then I still needed a way to get rid of this one, because the attack stats are quite high, and the only way I really had for this was to search another card out of my deck, and I had to give up on that one then. Then I searched for this one, because this one can actually threaten this, because this has the highest attack stats, which is quite important. So they have to negate this, because this card only protects it from targeting, not by effect destruction. So we have this going, so they had to negate this, but since this is only a negate and not a negate and destroy, we were actually fine here. Then we can go into the Link monster, which can bounce one of the cards, and we get another surge. This is where they feel like, oh no, I don't know what's happening. My board is slowly but steadily losing a bit of grip here on my opponent. So they want to go back for IP Masquerena. The great thing is I use this card's effect, and if when this goes through, I can actually search a card that can help me here very much, because it gains attack points for each monster they have on board, which is quite a lot. And triggering this effect triggers this card's effect. Since I could make this without this one, I can now bounce one of my opponent's monsters. I decide to go for IP Masquerena here, so I force out the effect. You can argue you might want to do this in a different way, because now obviously they use it, and I thought, okay, you have to use it this one as well. Technically I could have gotten rid of this one then, but then they could have still gone into Unicorn, put one of my cards back, so I wanted to make sure they get into nothing. So then use the effect of this card to send this to the graveyard and bounce this, so they can go into nothing, and then I have still enough Ancient Warriors on board to actually go into this card. This card had like 4,000 attack, and I could have run through them. I'm not sure if I would have OTK'd them that turn. I still had Book of Moon for the next turn. I still had another bounce during the next turn. I still had another pop during the next turn. So in total, there was probably a lot I could have done, and they saw that. So they did surrender in the end. Not sure if I played this 100% correct. Not sure they did. But you can see this deck has potential to actually do crazy things if your hand looks nice. I could also make you a compilation now of decks or of hands that are absolutely abysmal and they absolutely do nothing. I'd say like 3 out of 10 will be borderline unplayable or super easily disrupted, so keep that one in mind. Hope you enjoyed the deck profile. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, but most importantly, I hope you have a nice day.